everybody keep on joining in over the next minute. I'll just start with some basic logistical stuff and introductions. This webinar is being recorded and we are going to be sharing it once we've finished. My name's Alyssa Pacheco. I help handle media here at the American Immigration Council. We are an advocacy group that works to create a more just and fair immigration system. And we have a great panel today. We're going to be talking about the big policy changes that we saw the Biden administration do the previous week, and we're going to be exploring the different ways in which these policies may play out on the ground. So a couple of other logistical things. We'll be recording, we'll be sharing. Our general run of show will be, first off, we'll have Dara Lind, our senior media fill here at the council, and she's going to focus on what are the most important things that the new Biden policy actually does. Next in our run of show, we'll have Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, our policy director. He will discuss how the new policy is going to affect what's happening at the border. And lastly, we will have Pablo Balcazar, our policy associate, who will talk about our project in the council in which we help prepare individuals for their credible fear interview, which is the first step in the asylum process. So after our panelists speak, will probably be 7-8 minutes per person. We'll open it up to questions. There is a lot of us here, so please drop your questions in the QA box. As you know, feel free to do it while the discussion is happening and to do it when we open it up for Q&A. And what I'll try to do as the moderator is try to synthesize the questions as much as possible by theme, so that way we can make sure that we answer as many questions as possible. But there is a lot of us here, so unfortunately we probably won't be able to get to every question, but I'll try to moderate and synthesize them as much as we can. So again, if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. And yeah, Dara, do you want to kick us off and get started?
Sure. Thanks so much, Alyssa. And thanks to everyone for joining. I'm just going to be running down, there was enough kind of oversimplification and misreporting and just kind of reporting about what the president said as opposed to what the policy actually is, that we're just going to, we're going to have to break this down in two parts. Aaron's going to take more of the, on the ground operational realities, but I'm just going to take a little bit of time to run through what this did and didn't do on paper. So this was kind of broadly reported as the president is going to ban asylum for people who are entering between ports of entry if there's, if too many are coming. And some people were even saying like the president will now be able to just expel asylum seekers. That second part, not true. What this does, the meat of this is banning asylum. But what that means is the specific thing known as asylum in American immigration law, which is a specific form of relief that can be granted by, depending on the process, an asylum officer or a judge, and that allows you to get a green card down the road, that is no longer available under most circumstances for people crossing between ports of entry. It's not the same as Title 42, which was in place during the COVID pandemic, which allowed the government, or at least in practice, allowed the government to just push people either back to Mexico or back to their home countries within hours without even giving them, any opportunity to persuade the government that they needed to stay in the US because they were going to be persecuted or tortured. It's not that. So the way this actually works is if crossings reach a certain threshold, which is a 7-day average of 2,500 apprehensions a day, which is people being caught by Border Patrol or turning themselves into Border Patrol between ports of entry, then this new emergency border circumstances authority goes into effect. It was also already put into effect starting last week with the president's proclamation last Tuesday, but thanks to the regulation that got published alongside the proclamation going forward, that kind of 7-day rolling average will be the trigger on. There is also a trigger off if apprehensions fall below a rolling 7-day average of 1,500 over 7 days. And then, even then, the government has to wait another 14 days to actually turn the emergency border circumstances off. So in practice, if at any time during that 14-day wait period, you get back up to 2,500 on the average, then it would get triggered on before it was actually triggered off again. So given the patterns and apprehensions we've seen over the last several years, the likelihood that we would be actually seeing substantial amounts of time off of these emergency border circumstances is pretty low. We are looking at a quote unquote emergency that we expect to be the new normal for at least much of the time. But just so what actually happens under emergency border circumstances? Well, people can no longer get this discretionary thing known as asylum. They're still eligible for what's called withholding of removal or other protections under the Convention Against Torture. Those are the things that the US actually says are what keeps it within the International Refugee Convention. That the way that works in practice is there's a higher bar to qualify for those, and they offer less benefits at the end. They don't allow you to ultimately apply for a green card. They don't allow you to bring your family to settle with you in the United States. The Biden administration says that you're still eligible for those if, one, you have to proactively tell a Border Patrol agent or somebody or another government official that you fear persecution, that you intend to seek asylum, or you have to affirmatively manifest it and they have to notice it and write it down. If that happens, because in under what happened before last week, you had to actually ask someone before you deported them, do you fear removal to your home country or whatever country you were getting removed to? That obligation no longer applies. Now the obligation is just to notice if somebody is affirmatively doing this. Secondly, in the screening interview with an asylum officer, which prior to last week was under an elevated standard, but prior to the Biden administration coming into office entirely, was at a credible fear level. They've already kind of tightened this with various things, including the regulation that they put into effect last May. Now they're tightening that standard even more. And they've invented a new standard that you have, in order to pass that screening interview and qualify for a full hearing before an immigration judge, you have to demonstrate a significant probability that you would be persecuted or tortured if you were deported. And that is not currently defined, but they say it's supposed to be significantly higher, substantially higher than the existing standard for clearing a screening interview, but a little bit lower than a more likely than not standard. If you clear both of those hurdles, both the shout test, which is the kind of affirmative, I'm afraid, and pass the screening interview, then you are ultimately down the road eligible for a hearing before an immigration judge, at which you can get these lesser forms of relief that aren't quite asylum. There are some exceptions built in particular unaccompanied minors. This just doesn't apply to them at all. There are also a couple of exceptions that give discretion to line agents if there are operational considerations or significant humanitarian needs that would allow them to exempt somebody from this, so they'd be eligible for asylum at the end of the day, and the kind of additional procedural stuff wouldn't apply. In order to talk about kind of how all of that fits together, I'm going to turn it over to Erin, who's going to take this, convoluted but at least linear policy and complicate it a substantial amount more.
Yes, before we jump to Erin, we did get one question that I think might be good to clear up right away, that, is this already in effect now?
Yes, so to be clear, under the proclamation that Biden signed last week said, as of Monday, or as of midnight on Wednesday, whatever a week ago was, so June 6th or 5th. So in theory, the very, very, very earliest that we could see this emergency situation end would be 2 weeks from today. But that would require there to have been fewer than 1,500 apprehensions as an average over the week after it went into effect, which we don't have any reason to believe is the case. So it's likely that the very earliest would be something like 3 weeks from now, and we're not particularly expecting that either.
Great. Thanks for also clarifying that in the chat, Aaron. And now let's pass it over to you so you can explain how do we think this is playing out on the border, or what do we think is going to happen?
Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks, Dara. And once again, I thank you to all who are attending today. Incredible to see we have over 500 people here on this webinar. So thank you very much for your ongoing support. And this really shows how much interest there is in figuring out what actually went on. So, as Dara explained, the Biden administration's actions last week doesn't exactly shut the border, nor does it recreate the Title 42 rapid expulsion of migrants that existed from March 2020 through May 2023. So here's some other things the order didn't do. There aren't more asylum officers this week than there were last week. There aren't more Border Patrol agents this week than there were last week. There aren't more CBP officers working at ports of entry this week than there were last week, or ICE detention and removal officers. There are no new diplomatic agreements with Mexico to have this play out. There are no new diplomatic agreements with any country, in fact, to help this play out. And ICE didn't get any new planes to deport people, jail cells to hold people in, pilots to fly the planes, guards to guard the people, or anything along those lines. In short, what this order did is it changed some of the legal structure for asylum processing, but it did not affect any of the underlying diplomatic or resource limitations that are currently in play at the border. But as Dara explained, it does make it harder for some people to seek asylum, and that is going to mean an increase in deportations and a decrease in people being able to access the American humanitarian protection system. I want to explain that at first by looking at the major change in procedure that Dara mentioned, which is that Border Patrol agents will no longer be required to ask asylum seekers about whether they fear persecution, and will instead only refer somebody for a credible fear interview if that person manifests a fear of persecution or expressly tells an agent, I would like to seek asylum, I am afraid of persecution, something along those lines. So in theory, this change isn't that big, as many people could theoretically just say, I'm here to seek asylum, or they could express the fear. CBP says that they will be posting signs throughout all of their facilities, all Border Patrol facilities, telling people they can seek asylum and telling them to inform an agent if they want to do so. And they also say that they're going to be playing a video in English, Spanish, Hindi, and Mandarin at all of the largest processing centers that also say the exact same thing. So in theory, people should find out that they have a right to seek asylum and be able to still access the asylum process and get that credible fear interview. But what this means in practice is that the US government has gone from a system where asylum was part of the mandatory paperwork to a system where asylum is now optional paperwork, and one that requires border agents to actively pay attention to what people say and to record it and follow procedure. And what we know from previous versions of this shout test is that a lot of people will shout and the Border Patrol won't do their job. So we have some experience with that shout test in the past under Title 42 and under the Remain in Mexico program. In 2022, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies interviewed 97 asylum-seeking families who've been expelled back to Mexico across various different locations along the border. So not just in one location. So across multiple different locations, that meant they were dealing with multiple different Border Patrol agents and multiple different offices. And what they found is that 51 families out of those 97 reported having verbally expressed a fear to CBP agents or said they wanted to seek protection. Not a single one of them was referred for fear screening as required by policy at the time. And according to CGRS, some Border Patrol agents even told families to shut up when they said they were afraid, or told them that they had no right to an interview, which was not true. This is, of course, not to say that every agent will abandon their job duties or verbally abuse asylum seekers, far from it. But there is no doubt, given our previous experience, that some people who do manage to express a fear, who do know what the procedure is supposed to be, will nevertheless be ignored and not given a credible fear interview as required. So in practice, despite the right to seek asylum still being in here and the right to seek a protection screening still being in this rule, we know that many people who want to seek protection will not be given the opportunity to do so. But even though this is true, this will mean that they can issue more orders of deportation. The operational realities and resource constraints are still in place. Some countries do not accept deportations from the United States. Countries like China in particular heavily limit deportations. Less than 1,000 people were deported to China last year. Venezuela as well does not accept deportations, although Mexico does accept deportations of Venezuelans. Other countries are so far away from the US that it's not practical, given ICE resources, to fly deportation flights there. So from ICE's perspective, they can fly 3 planes to Guatemala in the time it might take to fly 1 plane to Asia, just because it's a 48-hour round trip to Asia and maybe a 6-hour round trip to Guatemala. And so as you can imagine, there are those operational considerations. So we have leaked guidance already about what this is actually going to look like on the ground. And this guidance issued to Border Patrol agents says the following: easily removable single adult migrants generally will not be released from DHS custody unless they receive a positive credible fear interview. And any exceptions have to be approved by US Border Patrol headquarters. So who are these easily removable single adults? These are people from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Cuba, and then the 4 countries that Mexico has agreed can be deported to Mexico: Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. These are the ones where flights are easy, as again, it's only a couple of hours flight from the southern border down to Guatemala. It's not even a couple hours. It's pretty short hop. And then the countries that let the United States deport people by bus directly across the land border. So we should see this population in particular. This was about 1 in 3 people crossing the border in April are in this easy to remove single adult category. So these are going to be target number 1. And we should see releases of those populations drop very low. And we should expect, again, that Border Patrol agents are going to make it very hard for these people to get credible fear interviews, and that the government is going to try not to release any of them. Then family units and single adults from harder to remove nationalities, those are going to be the prioritized second. So Central American family units will still be prioritized, but some of them will still have to be released. We don't have family detention anymore. So there is just a hard limit to how long they can hold families. Under the Flores settlement, that's 20 days if they can hold families in general. So if they can't put all of them through credible fear interviews or remove all of them, we will still see families being released. And then people from very hard to remove countries, this is especially African and Asian nationalities, generally will continue to be released at the border as they have been by and large for the last few years, and indeed even before that. So in other words, the system has become more arbitrary and more dependent on who you are than about how strong your asylum claim is. What country you come from, what's your nationality, did you arrive on your own, did you arrive with families? These questions are now more important to determining whether or not somebody can seek asylum than whether or not they have an asylum claim. And yet, so despite what the Biden administration says, there will still be, and in fact, we have seen this already, many people will still continue to be released at the border, but it is going to be more often these people from so-called hard to remove countries, whereas Mexicans, Central Americans, people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela who are crossing between ports of entry, these are the targets, and these are who the administration can crack down on more easily. Again, though, what I want to emphasize by talking about these resource limitations is that this is, by and large, the one thing that we haven't tried to do. The Biden administration says in this order that it would cost $755 million to hire 1,600 new asylum officers. Currently, there's fewer than 800 asylum officers. So what that means is to increase the number of asylum officers by 200% costs about $750 million. That is less than a quarter of the budget that Congress allocated for ICE detention this year. So it's not that funding the asylum system is impossible. It's not that we don't have the money for it. Instead, we're just throwing money at enforcement and detention, and we haven't actually ever invested the resources into the asylum system to actually allow us to have a system that is not fundamentally arbitrary. You know, what happens to you doesn't have anything to do with your claim and has everything to do with factors of international diplomacy that are far beyond any normal human being. This is the reason we are calling on Congress to act on these issues, because the Biden administration is correct. They cannot magic up this money on their own. And so the big impact of this order is not going to be a sealed border. It's going to be a border where some people get the sharp end of the stick and some people continue to be able to access the asylum process virtually unchanged. All of that has very little to do with the original intent of the asylum process. And it's unclear, you know, that this is going to send a message, especially as the message that people hear is going to be so muddled when they see that some people are still coming in and released within 24 hours, and some people are going to come in and then be held for weeks and then deported without ever being allowed to seek asylum. I think that is the big ultimate impact of this. But as Dara already said, it is going to take time to see what the impact of this is, given how complicated it is, given the impact on different populations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Pablo.
Yeah, go ahead, Pablo. Pablo's gonna speak about a project we run here at the council about supporting people for their credible fear interviews. So go ahead, Pablo.
Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody who's joining us. I'm really happy to see that so many people are engaged in such an important issue. So yes, I'm going to be running through some of the background on credible fear interviews in Customs and Border Patrol, our project, issues we've seen throughout our project, and how this news impacts everything. So last April, the Biden administration started conducting credible fear interviews in CBP custody for eligible individuals who are seeking asylum. While this was meant to streamline the asylum seeking process, it only complicated it further and exacerbated existing problems. So for decades, individuals seeking asylum would have their credible fear interview in ICE custody with a trained asylum officer, or after being released from custody and had some level of access to in-person counsel. But in CBP custody, attorneys are barred from entering facilities, so any consultation that happens must be over the phone, and the process is rushed. Making matters worse, due to the makeup of CBP custodies where the process is being conducted, individuals must be escorted to phones instead of having more regular access to them. Sorry about that, the dog sees a squirrel. More regular access to them like in ICE custody. So with this in mind, we started a project where we connect volunteers to people in CBP custody, and with the purpose of providing them with guidance on the CFI process and collecting information to report to the government what is going on in CBP custody with the consent of our callers, of course. So for example, we reported to CBP that we've had calls from individuals who do not speak Spanish as a first language, meaning that they should not be enrolled in the CFI process in CBP custody. As for how it works, when someone calls our hotline, if they get through on a time when our line is not open, or our line is open, but all of our volunteers are occupied, so they can't get through to a live person, they get a recording with some basic information about the CFI process, so they at least get information. Anyone can get information any day, time, day or night, whenever they do call. So far, our team of 23 people have spoken to 204 people in CBP custody or their family members, and that number is definitely growing as we have a shift going on even right now. So as far as like existing issues that were happening even before this announcement, so we're often reaching people who've already had their CFI interview because of when they're brought to the phones and when they actually end up having their interview. And this is the case even though we've told CBP about it repeatedly. So keeping this in mind, folks have often gone through a strenuous trip to reach the US, and then they're interviewed with like little time or preparation. So unsurprisingly, CBP reports that only 23% of people are passing their CFIs from CBP custody. So relating to this, individuals in CBP custody are ushered to the phones at all times, day or night. There's no set time frame for us to expect calls, so we need to spread out our volunteers as much as we can. And then we'll have plenty of calls 1 hour and then no calls the next hour. So it's pretty unpredictable, and it just makes it harder for us to get all the calls that we're getting in the hotline. Other issues that have come up include confusion on the number of calls individuals can have in CBP custody, or even being told that they have only one call when there's supposed to not be a limit, being forced off the phone mid-consultation, individuals calling families and having them call us thinking that we can represent them in proceedings. We've repeatedly told CBP to give us access to the video they show people upon arrival and the document with our number that is supposed to inform them of our purpose, but unfortunately we have not been shown it. We've just been told that it's less than 5 minutes long. So we've also come across, as I mentioned before, Indigenous language speakers who are not supposed to be enrolled in this process. So how does this new how does this news affect our project and the process in general? So currently, at least on paper, people are supposed to have at least 24 hours before their fear interview to consult with a lawyer to get some sort of consultation. That supposedly guaranteed time for consultation will now be reduced to just 4 hours. These 4 hours will only count if it's between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. and can carry on to the next day. So for example, if someone has 1 hour of access starting at 6 p.m. one day, they'll have 3 more hours starting at 7 a.m. the next day. This is a significant reduction from the 24-hour consultation period that they had before, which even then did not seem to get respected. Additionally, these consultation periods also count during the weekend, so someone could be detained late on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday and never have a chance to call us because we don't have hours then. So we've already expanded our hours from 3 hours a day for 2 days a week to 8 hours a day for 3 days a week, but now knowing this news, we'll likely have to expand our hours further and get more volunteers. So it's too early to say how this news has impacted our calling, as it has just happened for about a week, but we certainly think it's going to just blow up current issues that we already have, and because it's going to be rushing the process even more than it's already been rushed. So yeah, which will undoubtedly make more cases fall through the cracks for legitimate asylum seekers. And yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Alyssa.
Thanks, Pablo. And we will be sharing more information in the email that we send out after this webinar. If you're interested in volunteering for a project in which we help support people before their credible fear interviews, we'll be sending out information about how you can get involved helping folks right now. So I'm just going to synthesize a couple of questions. It looks like one thing that's still lacking clarity is what happens when people are released from custody, like yeah, Dara, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, yeah. So we've got a bunch of questions about like what happens to people who do make it to the immigration judge phase under this order. And I want to split those into two categories. One sub question is, okay, you've passed the shout test, you've passed this new, you've had a screening interview with an asylum officer, but you've met the reasonable probability standard, and so you've passed the screening interview and you're in front of an immigration judge. Are you only eligible, like is the immigration judge allowed to say, cool, you get asylum, or can they only say, cool, you get withholding of removal, or cool, you get protection under the Convention Against Torture? The answer is generally the latter, that even if you clear all of these hurdles, you're still not eligible for asylum at the end of it. There is one exception, which is because one of the differences between asylum and these lesser forms of relief is that a lesser form of relief doesn't allow you to bring family members with you. The judge, if the judge finds that one person in the family is eligible, like would qualify for relief, but the others wouldn't, and that's the one thing that's preventing the family from staying together, the judge can say, okay, fine, you can get asylum so that the family can get processed as an asylum recipient, and you don't have to separate the family just because of the difference between asylum and withholding. Generally, though, yeah, you have to not only do you have to clear the higher bars, but even at the end, you're not going to be eligible for full asylum under the terms of this. Now, the question about what happens if you get released from custody is the reason we haven't clarified that Like if you get released from custody, as in like Aaron was saying, you know, you're from a harder to remove country, you're a family unit, CBP says, okay, we're not going to put you through any of this, we're just going to release you into the United States with a court hearing down the road. What happens at that court hearing? The reason we haven't clarified that is that we don't know. There's a really, as we've mentioned, there's this exemption in the rule for operational considerations. We don't know how you can demonstrate how, like, we don't know what, like, how formally that's going to be done, right? Whether there's something that is going to be saying, you know, I, CBP officer XYZ, have exempted this person due to operational considerations. We don't think it's going to be that straightforward. And so it's going to be a really open question as to whether the government tells immigration judges that somebody who was released from custody should be considered exempt, whether immigration judges, whether the government doesn't say anything, but immigration judges construe it that way. There are a lot of open questions. What we expect is that, just like the regulation they passed last May, that a lot of people are going to be in for nasty surprises, right? That they won't necessarily have been put through these additional steps at the beginning of the process, but that at the end of the process, they'll show up before an immigration judge, and the judge will say, well, as far as you're concerned, everything that's happened to you so far is identical to what would have happened if you could get asylum, but now I'm going to tell you you were never eligible for asylum at all. That's a real concern, and how people are going to be expected to demonstrate in court that they were exempted as opposed to just being, you know, released but still subject to the ban on asylum is an open question.
Thanks, Sarah. Aaron, I think there was another question that you wanted to answer live from the chat.
Yeah, so there was a question, you know, if we have a new client who wishes to seek asylum, has a valid claim, but for some reason didn't verbally mention it to CBP, what do you recommend to do them to get the CFI? Assume they're still detained and just awaiting an imminent expedited removal. The answer is, in these circumstances, people will have to advocate aggressively for themselves. Now, of course, if there is an attorney that is representing them that has a G28 on file and can send something in and say, my client would like, fears persecution, give this person a CFI, and the person is actively pushing for it, one can hope that that will get it through. But this is the big problem. You know, it's always depended on Border Patrol filling out the right paperwork, and that's never been more true. At least in the past, there was a written record of whether or not somebody was asked the questions and given the opportunity to say they want to seek asylum. There will no longer be a written record of any of that. So that means that it's up to clients in many ways and people like in detention to assert their own rights. And of course, many people will not be able to because of language issues, because of confusion, because of just fear that they don't want to assert themselves, those, you know, to an armed Border Patrol agent in detention. But this is where, you know, we're going to have to hope that the government tries to keep track of this and tries to, you know, supervise things, and supervisors are making sure that agents are following guidance, because people will just have to actively assert, you know, their own rights.
Yeah, thanks for that, Aaron. It looks like another category of question that we're getting is what will happen to families, unaccompanied children, people who cross but they already have like an appointment with the CBP app. Could we sort of talk broadly about like the categories of people that we know sort of will be like affected by this, not affected, families and unaccompanied children, people using the app, etc.?
Yeah, so happy to jump in on this one. I will say people using the app should not be affected at all. This rule did not impact the CBP-1 process. So people coming through CBP-1 should, under this rule, have no change in process. They will still be eligible for asylum. They're neither banned by this new ban or the circumvention of lawful pathways rule. And they are, you know, in many ways able to access the asylum process exactly the same this week as they were last week. Unaccompanied children as well, no change at all. Unaccompanied children coming across the border should not see any change in how they are processed, treated, or their asylum eligibility. Family units, however, are impacted by this, people crossing together. And so, as I said, so Mexican family units, I think Guatemalan, Honduran, Salvadoran family units, I think we will see much greater numbers of them detained at the border and then rapidly deported without getting a credible fear interview. And I think that is one of the goals of the Biden administration right now. And you saw the New York Times explicitly report on this. We can put this in the chat as well and share a link to it, that the government wants to hold as many families as possible and deport as many families as they possibly can. But many of those families will hopefully be able to argue for a credible fear interview. We'll hopefully be able to connect with our volunteers, maybe, if they need some assistance. And so some will still go through the credible fear process, some will still pass this credible fear process, and some will still end up being released for the basic reason that the U.S. government, the Flores settlement, prevents the U.S. from locking families in Border Patrol detention centers for more than 20 days. So despite all the obstacles thrown up, many families will continue to be able to access systems. As Dara mentioned, it's unclear whether someone who is released due to operational considerations is still technically banned or not. This is a question that we think is going to have to be litigated in immigration courts most of the time. But even if a person is not subject to this new restriction, don't forget the May 2023 circumvention of lawful pathways rule is still in effect. So there are some people who will now be doubly banned and some people who will only be banned by circumvention of lawful pathways. And then there's some people like unaccompanied children and people coming through ports of entry through CBP1 that are not banned by anything. Again, a just blizzard of policies and web of confusion.
Yeah, blizzard of policies is definitely the right term. So sort of just like stepping back and looking at big picture, Jennifer Nagda asked this question. We'll love your opinion on where this policy falls along the spectrum that runs from one more strike against a functioning asylum system to the world's upside down. We've lost the right to seek asylum. Just sort of like big picture, where do we fall on this? Is this sort of like, is it accurate to say that this is like the end of asylum now? Like what do we see as the big picture being? Not sure if Dara or Aaron want to jump in on that.
Yeah, Dara, you want to start on that one?
So I think that I'm going to avoid the kind of like our opinion entirely and leave that to the council's policy director to answer. But something that I'll point out is there has been a lot of talk, not only from the administration itself, but from advocates saying this means asylum is over, that like you can't get asylum anymore, that like the US has, whether it's phrases the US has walked back on the right to seek asylum, or whether it's, but a lot of people emphasizing you can't get asylum in the US anymore. That is, as we've been saying, it's technically true. At the same time, to the extent that it's being interpreted as you can't get relief in the US anymore, that's not true. And so I personally would say it's really important to make sure that people who are considering, who like may be in need of protection and are considering seeking protection from the United States, not get the impression that there is absolutely nothing they can do to get protection in the United States unless they already have a CBP1 appointment or papers. That it is that there is, and it's subject to the essentially, all of the operational and discretionary considerations that Aaron talked about, but it is not true that the US is categorically refusing people the ability to seek protection from persecution. And I think that that's a really important message to get out there, not for like political reasons or for how we personally think about what the administration has done, but because that information could be the difference between somebody feeling that they can flee a situation in which they are likely to be persecuted or killed, and them not feeling that they have the ability to flee that situation.
Yeah, so I'd like to weigh in on this. I don't think we've more or less lost the right to seek asylum. At least again on paper there are still protections here, and I think it is important to acknowledge in U.S. law has asylum, then it has withholding of removal and protection of the Convention Against Torture, these other humanitarian protections. And so when we talk about the right to seek asylum, that is technically the right to seek a discretionary benefit versus sort of the right to avoid being removed to persecution. these are like super complicated, weird, but like what we've done is the right to seek humanitarian protection has not been lost. It has been heavily narrowed, I think is a way to say this. And the Biden administration would say, well, you know, people can just go through CBP-1 and they can apply for asylum as much as they want. So the big difference right now, I think, between the Trump administration's efforts to destroy asylum system and what the Biden administration has been doing is the Biden administration, at the very least, has kept alternate pathways open. Those alternate pathways are insufficient for the demand. They're not accessible for many people. They often require people to wait months and months in dangerous circumstances. So they are by no means an adequate substitute, but they exist, and we have to continue to acknowledge that they exist. And again, despite the Biden administration's rhetoric about this order, the fundamental resource limitations that apply mean that it's not going to be every Mexican turned away. It's not going to be every Central American turned away, but it is going to be more. And again, for these largely arbitrary reasons, unrelated to why we have asylum in the first place.
Thanks for that. It looks like another category of question that we're getting is people looking for more clarity of what happens once people are released. Are there certain categories of people who might be more likely to release than others? What happens when people are internally relocated? What about detention? And are there different, you know, what are sort of like the different exceptions under which someone would be released or not? It seems like there's still a lack of clarity around that. So, not sure if we want to talk over a little bit more of like what happens when people like enter and are then released into the country, to provide clarity around that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So the reason that we don't have clarity on that is because it's not really something that is in the proclamation, right? The proclamation doesn't say anything about here's when you release people, here's when you don't release people. The reason it doesn't is because it can't, right? Because those are subject to the resource constraints that Aaron was talking about earlier. And so everything we've seen from past, you know, whenever there's a border crackdown, what we tend to see on the ground is that it depends on where, you know, it depends on who you are, as Aaron talked through really thoroughly. It depends on what sector you're apprehended in. It depends on like what their resource constraints are that day, right? If ICE and CBP are having a real communication breakdown day and ICE is just not picking up the phone and CBP can't get people on buses into ICE custody, then they're going to be more likely to have to release people. It really is that arbitrary because it's based on these operational realities. So we don't, you know, with the exception of the guidance that Aaron talked through, which like we know it apply, you know, we know that that's like what San Diego sector was told at the end of last week. Like that's, we don't really know on any given day what's likely to happen to somebody. The government at a high level doesn't know either. The operators on the ground can see part of the picture, but they can't see the whole thing. And so what we're, you know, we assume that families and people from harder to, you know, what they were describing as harder to remove countries will be more likely to get released. We, you know, as we were saying earlier, we're not sure if that just means getting released, you know, but still being subject to the bar on asylum at the end of the process, or whether that means that they will be allowed to, you know, whether that means that an immigration judge will be able to give them asylum. But as far as kind of internal, you know, once they're released out of government custody, they still have the same abilities that people have had prior to this proclamation. They can, you know, decide where they're going to be settling. Ultimately, they still have to check in with ICE. They still have to, you know, show up for any court hearings that are scheduled for them. And, you know, it just kind of cross their fingers that the government actually does schedule them a court hearing in a reasonable amount of time. So, you know, it would be really nice if there were enough consistency in the application of this that we could give more clarity in terms of when people will get released and when people will be, you know, subjected to the extra procedural steps versus not. But we don't know, and we don't know because they don't know.
Thanks for that, Dara. Aaron, you wanted to take a couple of questions about Haitian Creole that we've been asked?
Yes, so there was a number of questions, I mentioned before about what signs posted in facilities are what languages they're going to be and what information is. And so a great immigration attorney, Taylor Levy, posted a leaked ICE guidance memo that implements this new order. And what the memo says, this is where we got, what languages the signs will be posted in. Again, it confirms the signs will only be in English and Spanish. And the videos will only be in those foreign languages mentioned before: English, Spanish, Hindi, and Mandarin. There will not be Haitian Creole signs anywhere. What they say is that, other places will have translations of the signs available if people want to find out about them. That's not something that's going to be practical for most people. Notably, this is the guidance for ICE. This is not the guidance for the Border Patrol, but similar guidance from the Border Patrol has been leaked as well, confirming this, so that there are only signs in 2 languages and the videos in 4 languages, and neither of them is Haitian Creole. So this is one of the reasons we are especially concerned about the ability of people to manifest fear, which again could be nonverbal. It could be like a person's facial expression, they say, or how a person acts, or it could be verbal. It could be somebody saying, I would like to seek asylum. But if there's not translators there at the time, if the agent doesn't understand the words the person uses, because the agents, a lot of them only speak English and Spanish, and some of them don't even speak Spanish that well, they will, of course, every person will get interviewed. They are still going to be processed as normal. So there will be a one-on-one process where each person is individually interviewed with an interpreter. So presumably that is where that process will occur, where that person could express a fear. But again, if they've never even seen the signs because they don't read the languages or understand it, this is another reason why specifically no longer asking the questions is going to produce fewer credible fear interviews, regardless of whether or not people's fears have changed. And hopefully, Alyssa's going to put that document that I mentioned into the chat. And the New York Times article mentioned is now in the answered column in the Q&A. I do see one really quick question that I can answer. Somebody said, is the law retroactive towards people who entered prior to this? This order is not retroactive. This order only applies to people who entered after 12:01 a.m. June 5th. So that's anyone who entered before then is not impacted at all.
Thanks, Aaron. Pablo, we're also getting a couple of questions about what qualifications volunteers need to work in the project. Are all the CFI interviews done by telephone? What about non-Spanish speakers? Sounds like it would be helpful if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so some of the most basic qualifications is that you do need to be a fluent Spanish speaker, because all of our volunteers are talking with folks in custody over the phone. And while they're speaking to these folks, they're filling out a intake form. So it's not just being fluent in speaking. You have to be very comfortable with listening to what they're saying and writing down what they say. So like I had said earlier, we're not only giving information, so reading out information to them as the volunteers follow an intake form, also writing down their information so that we can potentially flag their case for the government with their consent if anything seems very odd. So yes, they need to be a Spanish speaker, but if you're not a Spanish speaker, I would encourage you to reach out to us so we can keep you in mind for future volunteer opportunities, but unfortunately it would not be with this project. Other qualifications, you do not need to be a lawyer. We have lawyers that volunteer. We have folks that are in law school and folks who have never had any experience with law, but maybe they've done this in the past in a different capacity. And you don't even really need that experience. But for folks that are interested, we'll have them go through an orientation and go through a tech prep. And then we also do some minimal vetting. And then hopefully once you've gone through all of that, we go through some preparation before your shift, so you have an understanding of how the intake form works, where to ask if you have to ask questions, because we also have a chat open for folks that are volunteering so they can ask questions to a lawyer live. and how to submit all the forms appropriately. So yeah, happy to answer any more questions when it comes to that project.
Okay, it looks like another big category of question we're getting is just sort of like what happens next, what's going to happen next in terms of litigation. Again, it's sort of like tough for us to speculate on that, and we really try to focus on just analyzing the policies in front of us and not like gazing into the crystal ball. But Aaron, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about what we can say of sort of like what do we think is in the pipeline for what happens next.
Yeah, so the ACLU has said that they are planning to file a lawsuit. When President Trump invoked the same authority, INA Section 212F, the travel ban authority in 2018, for a similar effort to use a presidential proclamation as a springboard to an asylum ban, the ACLU sued and they won. The Biden administration says in this regulation that basically because this version has some more exceptions that they don't think they're bound by the previous court order, and therefore this one is legal. That is obviously something that is going to be tested in court. The ACLU has not said exactly when they're going to be filing the lawsuit, but certainly if you are a lawyer and you have a client that has already been affected by this, who has been turned away or denied access to asylum, and this is something that you've already seen, I'm sure if you contact the ACLU, they would be happy to hear about that as they prepare to file this lawsuit. But crucially, until such time as a lawsuit is filed and any kind of court order is issued, this rule will remain in effect.
Thanks for that, Aaron. We're also getting a big category of questions of people asking about accountability, transparency, and this sort of ties into how do we track, what happens further down the line with this? Like, how can we, be tracking if there's any like officers who like are abusive during this process, or just like tracking asylum rates or what's happening at the border? Like, what are different ways that we can be tracking accountability or transparency as this policy plays out, or is it even possible to do so?
I think we are keeping an eye on this. We will see the direct impact. The U.S. government does publish deportation numbers, but they publish them usually now on a multi-month delay. So we just got monthly, detailed breakdown numbers, including repatriation. We only got those numbers for February a few weeks ago. So we are not going to see any official government statistics on these for multiple months. We will see whether there might be an impact in border crossing sooner than that. But that is very different from the impact on people passing screenings. That said, the USCIS does publish data every 2 weeks on credible fear interviews. So if we suddenly see a big drop in the number of credible fear interviews occurring, or a big drop in the number of people passing them, that is something that we will be able to say, like, point to and see this. We are also at the council actively exploring further transparency efforts to hold the government accountable for everything that it's doing here.
Thanks for that, Aaron. All right, we've got 6 minutes left. We do have a hard stop at the end of the hour. We have some travel that needs to happen this afternoon. But Aaron, I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about, we've been talking about the border, asylum this whole time, but for all this attention on the border, could you talk a little bit about why, if we want the situation at the border to improve, we kind of need to like look beyond it and look at other parts of our immigration system? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I said a little bit at the end of the talk earlier, but the one thing that we've mentioned here as well is the problem right now is that we're looking at everything through the lens of the border. And that is also true for our legal immigration system. We also have to expand that lens and look at other ways that people can come here. There are so many people arriving in our border because they think asylum is the only door available to them, because we haven't updated our legal immigration system since 1990. The visa numbers that we have now, the process and the procedures is basically the same today as it was 34 years ago. And with that happening in a hypermobile world of political instability, more people are coming to our borders because they correctly see that they have no chance ever of coming here legally. So when we look at how to address the border, we have to look beyond just the lens of asylum and also look at, which is very important. Like, I want to emphasize again, these are fixable problems. We just have to invest the resources into that rather than pouring money into detention instead. But we also have to look beyond just asylum. We also have to look at our legal immigration system and really focus on expanding that and giving people access to better alternatives.
Thank you for that. And just really, really briefly before we close out, Pablo, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, you know, sort of what have you heard from volunteers about their experience in helping people in the Credible Fear interview project. And again, we will be sending out information in the email to everyone who registered about how to volunteer. But just was wondering if, Pablo, if you can talk a little bit about just like, what have you heard from volunteers, you know, about their experience working in this project so far?
Yes, of course. So while they maintain an impressive level of understanding and patience, we certainly have volunteers who've expressed some frustration with just how hopeless the process seems, because it really is, it's pretty rare for us to actually talk to someone who hasn't had their CFI interview yet. And the whole point of us having the lines up was so that we can help people before their CFI interview. Oftentimes, like I had mentioned, we're speaking with someone who's already had a negative interview, or maybe speaking to someone who has a deportation order, and all we can do is guide them through next steps, whether it's appealing for a hearing with a judge, or even just telling them, unfortunately, deportation is the next step and there's not much else we can do. But we also, like I had said, talk to family members who are asking for a lawyer, and we end up informing them a lot of times that it's just very hard to get actual legal representation through this process, just because of how rushed it is and just the nature of it all. But despite all of this, our volunteers are delivering really crucial information, even if it's just some simple clarity and peace of mind for folks that are calling, and even some really important cases that pop up, like I had mentioned, with folks that speak languages that are not Spanish. We get to flag those for CBP so that they can hopefully be moved into the different form of processing that would be appropriate for their case. Or even an example that happened recently was with a caller called us and explained that he got a negative in his CFI interview, but he didn't fully explain his fear because where the Credible Fear interview was happening, it wasn't very private. Because of the structure of the CBP facilities, the interview itself can be kind of heard through the walls, essentially. And he didn't want to share that he was harassed and harmed due to his sexuality, because he feared what would happen if people heard that and then he went back with the other folks that were in custody. So because he shared that with us over our phones, we were able to pass that on to CBP fairly quickly and make sure that he gets another CFI interview, hopefully in a more private setting, so he can more fully give his answer and hopefully get some sort of access to asylum. And we have multiple examples of when it comes to that, just flagging things for CBP. And that's why it's just so important for us to get information from our callers, and so important for our volunteers to connect with folks.
Thanks for that, Pablo. All right, we have a hard stop now, so I'm just going to be wrapping up with some final logistical remarks. Thank you so much, Pablo, Aaron, Dara, for joining us. Thank you so much for everyone who's here, who registered, for all your great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but in the email that we'll be sending out afterwards, we will be sharing some of the resources that we have about these issues. We'll be sharing a copy of this recording, and we'll be sharing more information about how you can volunteer for the Credible Fear interview project. And if there's questions that you had that you didn't think of during the panel, please feel free to email me, epacheco@imcouncil.org. And otherwise, yeah, thank you so much, everyone, again, and please stay in touch. And please send good vibes to Dara, who I think has to run to get on a plane now. So hopefully she'll have some safe travels and all this craziness.
Thank you. Yes, I am hoping that that I will not have to choose between, talking to the people and getting on the plane.
Yes. All right. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.